What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was incomplete? What if the story of the man billions worship as the Son of God had an entire missing chapter, one hidden not in Europe or the Middle East, but deep within the ancient highlands of Ethiopia? There lies a sacred text older than most Western Bibles, written in a language few can read and guarded by monks who have preserved it for centuries. Within its pages is a startling claim. Jesus, during his so-called lost years, journeyed not just through Judea, but all the way to Africa, specifically to Ethiopia. And according to these scriptures, he wasn't just a visitor. He was transformed. This isn't fiction. This is history most people have never heard of. Today we unravel the secrets of the Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest and most complete Bibles in the world, and dive into the controversial, profound, and hidden story of Black Jesus. Welcome to a journey through time, theology, and the untold African roots of Christianity. You may never see history or faith the same way again. To understand why the Ethiopian Bible is so important, we need to start with what sets it apart. The Western Bible most of us know, whether it's the King James Version, the New International Version, or even the Latin Vulgate, is based on a collection of 66 books. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, uses a version that contains over 80 books. That's right, 81 books in total. Among them are texts you've probably never heard of. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, and several writings attributed to prophets, apostles, and early patriarchs that were excluded from the canon during the councils of the Roman Empire. But it gets even more mysterious. While Western Christianity largely omits Jesus' life between ages 12 and 30, the Ethiopian scriptures and accompanying oral traditions suggest something radical, that Jesus may have traveled through Africa, especially Ethiopia, during these so-called silent years. And what's more, they describe him in terms that starkly contrast with the Europeanized image many grew up with. In these ancient texts and oral accounts, Jesus is described with dark skin, woolly hair, and eyes like burning bronze. Imagery strikingly similar to the descriptions found in the Book of Revelation. It's not just symbolic. In Ethiopian iconography, which dates back over 1,500 years, Jesus is consistently portrayed as a black man. These depictions weren't political statements. They were historical affirmations based on long-standing tradition and sacred texts unique to the region. So how did this version of Jesus disappear from mainstream Christianity? The answer lies in colonialism, geopolitics, and a centuries-long effort to shape religious narratives to match the aesthetics and ideologies of ruling powers. As European empires expanded across the globe, they exported their version of Christianity, complete with whitewashed images of Jesus, while suppressing the native traditions that contradicted their theology or challenged their dominance. But Ethiopia stood apart. Unlike almost every other African nation, Ethiopia was never colonized, except for a brief Italian occupation. This allowed the country to preserve its religious identity and protect its spiritual heritage from foreign interference. That's why the Ethiopian Bible exists as a time capsule, untouched by the selective edits of Western councils. It offers a glimpse into Christianity as it may have existed in its earliest, most unfiltered form. The idea of Jesus traveling to Ethiopia isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. Ethiopia already had strong religious connections to Israel long before Christianity. The Queen of Sheba, an Ethiopian ruler mentioned in both the Bible and the Quran, famously visited King Solomon nearly 1,000 years before Jesus' birth. According to Ethiopian tradition, she bore Solomon a son, Menelik I, who would become Ethiopia's first emperor and bring the Ark of the Covenant to Axum, where many believe it still resides to this day. This royal bloodline, known as the Solomonic dynasty, claimed descent from both David and Solomon, making Ethiopia a spiritual cousin of ancient Israel. By the time Jesus was born, Ethiopia was home to large Jewish communities and steeped in prophetic traditions. It's entirely plausible that a young Jesus, in search of wisdom, spiritual insight, and refuge from Herod's reach, might have found his way south through Egypt into Ethiopia, a land rich in religious mystery and messianic expectation. Some scholars point to the Gospel of Matthew for clues. After all, it's the only gospel that mentions the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre of infants. But what if Egypt wasn't the final stop? What if they kept going? The Ethiopian book of the Synaxarium, a liturgical text filled with stories of saints and holy figures, contains references to Jesus traveling through Axum and interacting with early Ethiopian sages. According to these accounts, he studied ancient scriptures, debated with temple priests, and even healed the sick along the Nile. These aren't mere legends. They're part of a consistent oral tradition passed down for nearly 2 millennia, protected by monks who live in stone-hewn monasteries inaccessible to the outside world. One such place is the Debre Demo monastery, perched high atop a flat mountain and accessible only by rope. Here, monks still read from Ge'ez manuscripts that haven't been translated into any modern language. These texts, kept from colonial powers, scholars, and tourists, hold some of the deepest mysteries of the Christian faith, including what some claim are direct accounts of Jesus' teachings during his lost years. This idea challenges more than just geography. It disrupts theology. If Jesus indeed spent formative years in Africa, absorbing its spiritual traditions and wisdom, then the roots of Christianity are not only more diverse than most have been taught, but deeply, undeniably African. This would reframe the entire narrative. It means that Christianity didn't simply spread to Africa, it was formed in Africa, refined in its deserts, and shaped by its people. It challenges the Eurocentric lens through which most of the world views Christian history, and forces us to consider how much of our understanding has been filtered through politics, power, and empire. Let's go even deeper. Consider the Book of Enoch, a text revered in Ethiopia but excluded from Western Bibles. This book describes the heavenly realm, fallen angels, and apocalyptic visions that mirror much of what we see in Revelation. But here's the twist. Enoch, according to tradition, was the great-grandfather of Noah. His writings were believed to be so sacred that early Christians, especially those in Ethiopia, kept them central to their theology. In fact, scholars believe Jesus himself may have quoted from Enoch, particularly when speaking about the Son of Man and the final judgment. The early church fathers referenced it. Even the writer of the Epistle of Jude directly cites it. Yet the book was later banned by the Roman Church and vanished from most biblical canons, except in Ethiopia. Why? Because it didn't fit the sanitized, controlled narrative Western leaders were building. The Book of Enoch doesn't paint a picture of a distant, mild savior. It speaks of a cosmic warrior, a divine judge, and a deeply spiritual mission tied to ancient African and Semitic cosmologies. In short, it was too radical, too powerful, too black. And that's not all. The Ethiopian Bible includes texts that amplify women's roles in sacred history, describe visions of heaven in vivid detail, and emphasize justice, humility, and divine retribution in ways that mirror African oral traditions far more than Greco-Roman philosophies. The influence of these books is unmistakable. So why were they hidden? The answer once again leads us to empire. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century and convened the Council of Nicaea, A process began to shape the faith into something that could support an empire, not challenge it. The goal wasn't truth, it was control. And to control a religion, you have to control its narrative. This meant removing texts, voices, and histories that didn't align with the Roman worldview. Ethiopia, isolated and defiant, refused to play along. And because of that, Ethiopia preserved something priceless, an unbroken line to Christianity's ancient, multicultural roots. It maintained a vision of Jesus that looked like the people he came to serve, a theology rooted in justice rather than empire, and scriptures that were messy, mystical, and radically inclusive. In the next half of this documentary, we'll journey further into the mountains of Lalibela, explore the legend of the Ark of the Covenant in Axum, uncover more suppressed texts, and investigate how modern scholars and theologians are now re-evaluating the idea of a black Jesus, not as revisionism, but as restoration. But first, let's pause and reflect. What does it mean when the truth of a faith is hidden, not by enemies, but by those who claim to defend it? Let's now pick up where we left off, deep in the spiritual terrain of Ethiopia, where faith is not just a practice, but a living history. The story of Black Jesus, preserved through the Ethiopian Bible and its surrounding traditions, forces us to re-examine what we've been taught about sacred history. And central to this challenge is a simple yet profound question. What if the face of God, of divinity itself, was always meant to reflect the diversity of humanity? In the heart of Lalibela, an ancient town carved out of red volcanic rock, 11 monolithic churches stand, chiseled from the ground down. Built in the 12th century and still active today, these churches weren't just places of worship. They were political and spiritual declarations. Their very construction reflects a vision of Christianity rooted in Africa, independent of Rome, Constantinople, or any external force. And within these walls, Jesus is not a foreign visitor. He is a native son. Here, the walls are adorned with murals of Mary with dark skin, angels with Afro-textured hair, and a Messiah who looks like the people who worship him. This isn't an anomaly, it's the result of a tradition passed down uninterrupted for nearly 2,000 years. These churches were commissioned by King Lalibela, a monarch believed to have been divinely guided, to recreate a new Jerusalem in Ethiopia after Muslim conquests had made pilgrimages to the Holy Land nearly impossible. He and his subjects saw no division between their African identity and their Christian faith. What makes this even more remarkable is that this vision existed long before Europeans reached sub-Saharan Africa with their own version of the gospel. In fact, by the time Portuguese missionaries arrived in the 15th century, they were shocked to find Ethiopians already practicing a vibrant, scripture-rich, and independent form of Christianity that had nothing to do with Rome. The Bible was written in Ge'ez, a Semitic language older than Arabic, and the theology was more ancient and, in many ways, more complete than what Europe had preserved. So let's talk about these lost scriptures, these books omitted from Western canon but preserved in Ethiopian tradition. The Book of Jubilees, for example, gives an alternative version of Genesis and Exodus, offering details about angels, the heavenly tablets, and God's covenant that are missing from standard texts. It emphasizes moral responsibility, time cycles, and the sacredness of Ethiopia itself as a divine land. Jubilees speaks of a world watched over by divine forces, where every human action echoes through generations, a deeply African spiritual concept of ancestry and legacy. Another significant text is the Ascension of Isaiah. This book provides mystical visions of heaven, layers of spiritual realms, and the pre-incarnate Christ descending through these levels in humility to take on human form. The imagery is vivid, cosmic, and strikingly different from the Greco-Roman lens through which most people read the Gospels. This was a Christianity immersed in awe and mystery, not theological rigidity or imperial control. But beyond the texts, we must also confront the way these beliefs have shaped real lives and real resistance. Take, for instance, the story of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews. For centuries, they lived in the northern regions of Ethiopia, practicing an ancient form of Judaism rooted in the Torah, the Book of Enoch, and other scriptures now lost to most of the world. Many scholars believe they are direct descendants of the tribe of Dan, who journeyed south with Menelik I. But more than their origins, their continued existence into the modern age suggests a deep, undeniable continuity between Israel's ancient faith and African heritage. Christianity in Ethiopia did not grow from colonial missionaries or papal decrees. It grew from prophetic tradition, from messianic hope, from sacred memory. And Jesus in this tradition is not a Roman figure with northern European features. He is Emmanuel, God with us, born into a region where dark skin was the norm, where Hebrew and African bloodlines intertwined, where the desert winds carried both scripture and struggle. In this vision, Jesus becomes more than a symbol. He becomes a bridge between continents, between races, between traditions. He speaks the language of the oppressed and the exiled, not the language of emperors and colonizers. He doesn't merely visit Ethiopia, he is shaped by it. He teaches in its temples, drinks from its rivers, and perhaps, as these ancient accounts suggest, leaves behind followers whose descendants still chant his words in Ge'ez under starry African skies. This is not just a historical curiosity. It has real implications for how billions perceive themselves today. When people see Jesus only through a Western lens, they often inherit a spiritual identity disconnected from their own culture, their own roots. But the Ethiopian story offers another way, a chance to reclaim a Christ who resembles the diverse global community that follows him. It's no surprise then that this vision of Jesus has often been ignored, silenced, or dismissed. For centuries, Western scholars downplayed Ethiopia's theological depth, portraying African Christianity as a derivative or lesser version of European faith. But in recent years, that narrative is being challenged. Archaeologists, historians, and theologians are now revisiting Ethiopia's vast manuscript libraries, uncovering scrolls written centuries before Gutenberg's press ever ran. Digital projects like the Ethiopian Manuscript Imaging Project are scanning and translating texts that have never been seen by Western eyes, and what they reveal is stunning. Detailed accounts of early Christian cosmology, alternative gospel traditions, and radical visions of divine justice rooted in African values. All of this points to one undeniable truth. Africa didn't just receive Christianity, it helped shape it. And perhaps the most powerful symbol of that shaping is the image of Black Jesus. Not as a political statement, not as a modern correction, but as a restoration of what once was, of a faith born in the sands of Judea and nurtured in the highlands of Ethiopia, among a people who never needed Rome to find salvation. So if this vision is so rich, so ancient, so powerful, why isn't it more widely known? Because history isn't just what happened, it's what was allowed to be remembered. In the final part of this video, we'll uncover how this suppressed history is resurfacing in the 21st century, how it's empowering a new generation of seekers, and why the legacy of the Ethiopian Bible and Black Jesus is more important now than ever before. Stay with us. Today, the Ethiopian Bible and the story of Black Jesus are no longer whispers in isolated monasteries. They are rising to the surface, challenging deeply entrenched beliefs across continents. In universities, seminaries, and grassroots communities, people are beginning to ask bold questions. What parts of our faith were edited? What parts were stolen? And what happens when we reclaim them? One of the clearest signs of this resurgence lies in the growing global interest in Ethiopian Christianity. Pilgrims, researchers, and spiritual seekers now travel to places like Aksum, Lalibela, and Debre Libanos, not just for the scenery, but to understand a version of Christianity that predates the Vatican and predates Europe's involvement with the gospel altogether. They are drawn to the rock-hewn churches where prayers echo from ancient stone, to monks who recite liturgy in Ge'ez, a language spoken by angels, as the Ethiopians believe, to ancient texts preserved not in glass cases but in living rituals, passed hand to hand, word to word, through generations untouched by colonial pens. This isn't revisionist history, it's restoration, the restoration of Africa's rightful place in the Christian story. For centuries, African Christianity was either marginalized or erased from the dominant narrative. It was boxed into the idea of missionaries bringing light to a dark continent. But Ethiopia stands as living proof that Africa had the light all along, and that light is now illuminating more than just theology. It's redefining identity. For millions of people in the African diaspora, the image of a black Jesus is not just spiritually affirming, it's psychologically liberating. It counters centuries of indoctrination that painted holiness in European tones and whiteness as divine. When Jesus is depicted as black, it disrupts the internalized hierarchy of value placed on race. It offers a new mirror, a divine one, where African features are sacred, where blackness is not a stain, but a reflection of the divine. And it goes even deeper. The teachings preserved in the Ethiopian tradition emphasize humility, justice, community, and spiritual depth over political power. Jesus, in this tradition, is not a distant king, but a present shepherd. He challenges injustice, uplifts the poor, and walks with the oppressed. His message is not about empire, it's about equality. Not about obedience to Rome, but about the freedom of the soul. This vision has started influencing new conversations in global Christianity. Scholars are revisiting long-dismissed texts. Seminaries are offering courses on African theology. Churches across the world are slowly beginning to integrate the broader, more inclusive story of Christianity's roots. But not everyone welcomes this shift. For those whose power rests on tightly controlled traditions and Eurocentric images, the return of Black Jesus poses a threat, not because it's false, but because it's true. Truth has the power to undo centuries of propaganda. And so, as this truth rises, resistance grows alongside it. Yet history has shown us that truth, like light, cannot stay hidden forever. The same Ethiopia that kept the Ark of the Covenant hidden for millennia, the same country that stood against colonization, the same nation that guarded sacred scriptures through war, famine, and invasion, has preserved a spiritual treasure the world is only now beginning to rediscover. And as the Ethiopian Bible begins to speak to the modern world, it reminds us that our understanding of Jesus and of ourselves is still evolving. So what does this mean for you, the viewer? It means that you are standing at the edge of a deeper truth, a broader vision, and a more powerful spiritual heritage than you might have ever imagined. You're no longer bound by the narrow teachings of one version of history. The story of Black Jesus, of the Ethiopian Bible, of a Christianity born in the East and nurtured in Africa. This story is yours now, too. It invites you to question what you've been taught, to seek wisdom from sources once dismissed, and to look into the face of Jesus and see not a stranger, but someone who looks like humanity itself. Someone who crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and sat among African sages long before Western empires placed him on stained glass windows. And that changes everything. Because when Jesus is no longer whitewashed, when he is seen in his full historical and cultural truth, then every person from every corner of the earth can finally see themselves reflected in divinity. And that, perhaps, was always the point. So let this be a beginning, not an end. Dive into the Ethiopian texts. Explore the paintings of black saints. Read the Book of Enoch. Listen to the chants of Jier's monks. Reclaim the history that was hidden. The truth was never lost. It was simply waiting to be found. And now you've found it.